Hey there, Mama. You're listening to the Lift the Shame podcast. I'm your host, Crystal, mama of 5 and your family's intuitive eating dietitian, here to help you cut through the diet culture clutter so you can enjoy freedom with food as a family. I'm on a mission to help you end the generational legacy of diet culture in your home so you can experience motherhood free from food guilt and body shame. Listen in weekly for guidance on how you can ditch diet culture, heal your relationship with food and your body, and confidently raise intuitive eaters. Let's dive in and lift the shame together. Welcome back to the podcast, Mama. Over the last couple of weeks, we've been talking a little bit about intuitive eating and what that looks like for moms. And now we're going to transition a little bit into raising an intuitive eater and what that looks like, and some myths surrounding what raising an intuitive eater can look like as well. This is actually one of my favorite topics and one that I get really passionate about because it's something that I think moms, particularly who are in eating disorder recovery, do feel stuck in and get a lot of guilt and feelings of shame around, because again, there's this whole idea that in order to raise an intuitive eater, I need to be an intuitive eater. I need to be in a place where I have an amazing relationship with food. And you may not be in that place. You may still be struggling, or you may just still feel at odds with food or your body. And I know for a fact that it can feel like you're a fraud trying to emulate these behaviors around food in your body that you want your child to develop when you feel like, I can't do this myself. You might feel stuck. You might feel like I'm failing. You might really be concerned that because you're not in a solid place with your own relationship with food, that you're doing harm to your child. And I know that can be really heavy and just hard to navigate. And so I wanted to talk a little bit more about this. And this episode is going to be focusing on 3 main myths that I see around raising an intuitive eater. And my hope is that I can just start to help you clear some of the clutter and confusion that you might have around this topic in order to give yourself freedom to build a feeding relationship with your child that feels positive, that feels trusting. And at the end of the day, that's what matters most, is the connection that you're forming with your child around food and around their bodies. And the best part of this, and I hope you really hear me when I say this, is that you don't have to have it all together or all figured out or all perfect. I mean, that's not even possible. Perfect when it comes to food and our bodies and our relationship with food and our bodies. Like, we need to challenge that arbitrary standard because that is rooted in diet culture. And I don't want that to prevent you from enjoying a relationship with your child that's founded on connection and trust, because ultimately that is going to help support you in raising a child who does feel confident in their bodies and who can trust their bodies to help them navigate the world of food choices that they will face. So we are going to dive in today and talk about, again, 3 common myths around raising an intuitive eater and what that looks like. Part of this, again, similarly to what intuitive eating might look like for you as a mom, there has been a lot of misinformation out there. And again, social media, for all the amazing things that it can bring, when an idea becomes mainstream, especially on social media, there can be a lot of misinterpretations of what this concept or what this idea is. And so I just want to bring some clarity to it, because especially when it comes to intuitive eating for kids, there is a lot of confusion around that. And we're going to talk a little bit more about why that is. And, you know, depending on which Instagram account you might be following, you may have heard some things, or you may have tried to implement some things, but might be wondering if you're getting stuck, if you're doing something wrong. And so I just want to, again, bring some clarity around this. And we will be talking more over the upcoming weeks. And I'm hoping to bring on some guests and just have more conversations around the deeper piece of this, which is nurturing a relationship and connection with your child. I think, again, when you've been a mom in eating disorder recovery, or you're just navigating motherhood in diet culture and you just want to protect your kids from that, when we are approaching feeding from that lens, it puts so much emphasis and focus on the food itself. And I really just want to start helping you be able to zoom out and see the bird's eye view, because it's, feeding is an extension of parenting, and there's a lot of layers connected to how we feed our kids. And again, it's about the deeper relationship that we're building and forming with our child and learning to become responsive to the child in front of us versus following a set of rules or trying to get our child to fit this box or mold that they're never going to fit. And again, there's a lot of different moving parts and pieces here, and I am excited to dive into this topic. But first, let's talk about the elephant in the room. Let's chat about some of the myths that surround this idea of raising an intuitive eater. And the first one here is, and you've heard me allude to this already, but this idea that you have to be an intuitive eater in order to raise an intuitive eater. If you've been around here long enough or have followed any of my work, you have heard me say that you do not have to be an intuitive eater to raise one. Or in another frame of reference, you can raise an intuitive eater even when you're learning to become one yourself. And I hope that just allows you to give you some space and just takes a burden off of your shoulders, because again, as parents, especially as moms in eating disorder recovery, we are desperate to get it right. We want to do everything within our power and capacity to prevent our children from potentially dealing with some of the same issues that we dealt with. Sometimes, though, this creates unrealistic standards, and it just puts intense pressure on us as parents, as moms, in terms of what our relationship with food needs to look like in order to help our kids have a healthy and positive relationship with food. One thing that I just want you to understand is that your children are already born with innate intuitive eating abilities. And that actually has nothing to do with you. I know there's this idea that, somehow we have to instill it in our kids, or we have to develop it, or we have to help them develop it. But again, the reality is that your children already have those innate intuitive eating abilities within themselves. Okay. And it's less about what we have to do and more about what we have to preserve. The great thing is that there's so many things that you can do to help preserve your child's innate intuitive eating abilities, even if you are still figuring things out for yourself. And, that is the interesting thing about being a parent is oftentimes when we have children, it just brings so much stuff to the surface, right? I will say for myself, being a mom, nothing has healed me more than motherhood, in the sense of confronting my demons that I thought had been eliminated or were somehow no longer part of my life, or really just things that were hidden that I hadn't really addressed. But becoming a parent really forces you to look at those things and to grow and evolve and to heal in ways that you maybe haven't before. But, having the responsibility of nurturing and caring for a child really does kind of force you to look at those different parts of yourself that may have been hidden. And food and our bodies is no exception from that. One thing that I think is really beautiful too is that our children really are our best teachers if we allow them to be. And again, there's so much pressure on what are we going to teach our kids? What are we going to help them learn? And sometimes raising an intuitive eater is less about what we're teaching them and more about what we allow them to teach us. And this has certainly been the case for me, and especially in my early years of motherhood. But there's been so many times where watching my kids eat has actually really been like therapeutic for me and just healing, like being able to see that my kids have a relationship with food that's not broken, and they are able to listen to their bodies and eat in a way that is life-giving to them. As someone who has had a very tumultuous relationship with food and who really can't remember thinking about food in a way that was pleasurable, but more through like a good, bad lens, it's really refreshing to see that. And again, those abilities are intact in our children. Your child being able to eat intuitively does not hinge on your ability to eat intuitively. I really want you to hear that. And, it doesn't mean that we're stagnant in our relationship with food. On the contrary, I think it's important that we are active in healing our relationship with food and connecting to appropriate support. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in next week's episode in terms of things that you can do to support your child when it comes to raising an intuitive eater. Even if you feel like, I'm struggling in my relationship with food, or I'm still figuring this out, I've got you. Make sure you tune into our episode next week. But, I just wanted to bust this myth right out of the gates that, look, even if you're struggling in your relationship with food, even if becoming a mom has just resurfaced your eating disorder in full force, or you just find yourself struggling, or you're really having a hard time navigating how to feed yourself in this season of motherhood, please rest assured you are okay. And your child already has their innate intuitive eating abilities. You're not screwing them up. You're not going to ruin them. You are doing so much already to support them, more than I think you give yourself credit for. And again, we're going to chat more about some ways that you can actively be supporting them and preserving those intuitive eating abilities. But please understand that your child being able to eat intuitively is not hinging on your ability to do that. It's important to separate that and to separate what your experiences with food have been like from your child, because you and your kids are different people. And in order to support their autonomy and their agency around food in their bodies, we have to constantly be telling ourselves that, okay, look, my experience around food in my body has not been my child's, and I'm going to come alongside them and support them and do the best that I can, while also be working on myself and my relationship with food and my body, and trust the process. Okay. So that's the first myth there. Second myth here is that it kind of piggybacks on the first one, but just this pressure that like we have to teach our kids what hunger and fullness is and what that feels like in their body. I have seen a few things circulating around social media about this, which is why I felt it important to talk about this and clarify this more, because our kids are already born with the innate intuitive eating abilities to self-regulate what they need. Okay. It's not our job to teach them that. It's not our job to teach them what hunger feels like or what fullness looks like. And this is where I think the waters start to get muddied when it comes to what intuitive eating looks like for adults versus what intuitive eating looks like for children. Okay. If you go back to episode 4, when we're talking about intuitive eating, remember that the approach to intuitive eating was designed to help people heal a broken relationship with food. Okay. 99% of the time, kids do not meet that criteria. Okay. When we're talking about raising an intuitive eater, we're not talking about raising up a child who previously had a broken relationship with food. That's not the case. So understanding that concept is really important, because we can't transcribe all the intuitive eating principles directly to our children. Okay. It's going to look differently for our kids than it does for adults who are healing a broken relationship with food. We were all actually born with intuitive eating abilities. And somewhere along the way, they were broken, they were lost, they were hidden, they were dismissed, or we disassociated from them for different reasons. And so learning to eat intuitively is kind of repairing that damage. Kids have not had that experience where they're healing from a broken relationship with food. And so again, understanding that is going to be really important because we're not necessarily going to use the same tools when it comes to intuitive eating for an adult that we would for a child. What I mean by that is, so for example, I have seen like hunger and fullness scales circulating the internet that are supposed to be used for kids in a way to teach them what different degrees of hunger feel like and different degrees of fullness might feel like. And, I understand there's good intention behind that, but the only person living in your child's body is your child. Okay. And this is something, again, that is going to be really important to start separating ourselves from. Like, what amount of food might feel satiating to us may not be the same for your child, and vice versa. And this is where I start to see a lot of parents sometimes get stuck in this worry vortex around eating and around feeding their child when, we start to overanalyze what our kids are eating or how much they're eating, or we start to undermine what our kids might be saying or expressing about how they're feeling in their bodies. And sometimes there's a discrepancy, there's a gap between our expectations around what we think our kids should be eating and how much they should be they should be eating versus what our kids are actually experiencing in their bodies, excuse me. It really draws back to busting this myth that it's our responsibility to teach them hunger and fullness. It's not. Again, our kids already have those innate, intact ability to gauge their hunger and fullness. And if you've ever watched a child eat, especially a young child, then you will know this is absolutely true. I love to tell this story. You might have heard me tell this before, but my son, so we have 4 girls and 1 boy, and my son, who was maybe, 3 or 4 at the time, I remember we were having snack and I had made some brownies and he wanted a brownie for snack. So I gave him a brownie and a glass of milk, and I sat down and was eating some with him. And I'll never forget, I think I even took a picture of it somewhere. I need to find it, but I'll never forget, he ate all of his brownie until one last little bite. But the bite was so small, it was like not even like a full bite of a brownie left. And he literally left that little tiny piece of brownie on his plate and was like, "I'm done. Bye, Mom." And just like got up and left and went to go play or whatever. And I just sat there like laughing to myself, looking at the tiniest little bite of brownie on his plate. And like, who does that? Like, I know for me, sweets were so chaotic and such a chaotic part of my eating disorder. I really struggled with sweets and just learning how to eat sweets. And that was something that I really had to, renegotiate, especially when I had kids, and just remind myself that my experiences around sweets have not been my kids and that I can trust them to eat sweets, even if I can't, if I've had that history of not being able to trust myself. It just was so healing, but also like humorous to me that my son literally ate and did not eat one tiny bite over what he needed. It was like if that was me, I'd have been like, oh, it's just like a little tiny bite left. Like, no big deal. Like, I can totally eat that and it's not going to do anything for me. But, like kids, like when we watch how they eat, it's so amazing. Like, they truly are able to self-regulate down to the very bite. And we want to preserve that. Like, again, like that was nothing that I had to teach him. Didn't have to show him a chart or say, "Okay, buddy, when your tummy feels this full, then you need to stop." Our kids do that on their own. We want to just support them by creating a positive eating environment in which they can connect to their cues. There's definitely a lot of nuance here. I just want to say too, like if you are raising a neurodivergent child, and I actually have 2 ADHDers myself, and so, there's a lot there that we're going to talk about in future episodes, but sometimes there may be situations where you feel like, oh my gosh, like my kid cannot regulate, or there's so much going on that my kid has no sense of connection to their body. Even children who are neurodivergent or going through different situations in their life where they may be disconnected from their body in some regard, still have that innate ability to self-regulate. It is still there. We just want to support our kids in creating an environment in which they are able to listen to and gauge those cues. It's not our job in terms of raising an intuitive eater. It's not our job to also teach them what hunger and fullness looks like. The other reason why this is important is because hunger and fullness occurs on a spectrum and looks differently for everybody. Sometimes kids feel content eating a lower volume of food, and that feels satiating for them. Other times they need a higher volume of food. Again, it occurs on a spectrum. It's going to look differently for everyone. So if we try to teach our kids what hunger and fullness looks like, we may potentially be eroding trust in their bodies because their experience of hunger and fullness may not look like what we think hunger and fullness should look like. Okay. So just keep that in mind. I really wanted to touch on this. I have a lot more to say on this. And if you have questions about this particular point, I would love to hear about it, and we'll potentially be doing some future episodes on this particular topic too. Last myth here that I want to touch on is implementing structure is a form of restriction. This is a huge myth, and this is a myth that I actually see a lot of parents in eating disorder recovery getting hung up on or struggling with. And in fact, if you resonate with this, I want to hear from you and want to see if maybe you're needing some more resources around this so I can help share more of that with you. But for those of us who have had a difficult relationship with food, a difficult upbringing with food, the thought of implementing structure for our child around food feels restrictive, right? I remember feeling like this too when I was first navigating feeding my own kids when they were a lot smaller, well, if I'm eating intuitively and if I'm eating at times where my body is telling me that I need food, shouldn't I allow the same for my child? Shouldn't I allow my child to just tell me when they're hungry and I'll feed them at that point? I think a lot of this stems from our own upbringing around food. I see two extremes here. If you grew up in an environment where there was more control around food. So like if you were forced to eat certain things, or there was a lot of rigidity or rules around food, or maybe you weren't allowed access to eat certain things, that kind of approach to food. I see a lot of parents who are now raising their own children and who are like, I want to do the complete opposite of that. I don't want to impose any restrictions on my child. I want to make sure that they never feel guilt or shame for asking for anything. And so there's no rules. We just let them eat whatever they want, whenever they want. And I get that. Like, I totally get that. And I totally resonate with that. The other side is you might have had an upbringing that was maybe more permissive or even negligent. Like if you didn't have a parent who took any leadership with food and just provided kind of free reign, free access to whatever was available, or you just kind of had to fend for yourself and figure things out when it came to food, that can also create this, you didn't have it modeled to you what a healthy approach to food or feeding a child might look like, right? Like, what does it look like to take leadership with food in a way that offers support, but that is not rigid or restrictive? And when it comes to raising an intuitive eater, again, this is built on the foundation of understanding that your child already has innate intuitive eating abilities, okay? The thing is that we don't want to put any undue pressure on our child to bear the responsibility of deciding when they need to eat, of deciding what to eat, of how to put a meal together. Cognitively, developmentally, our children don't have that capacity. And putting that responsibility on them can actually make food more chaotic. If your child has to bear the responsibility of figuring out those aspects of feeding, then it can interfere with their ability to listen to their hunger and fullness cues. I like to use the term more of like a flexible approach, like a flexible structure. And I think structure can be, it can kind of like rub us the wrong way, especially if we had a restrictive upbringing around food, or we're healing from our own, restrictive eating behaviors. I think the term structure can feel like kind of yucky, right? And so I want you to rethink what structure means. When you're providing structure, you're basically providing guardrails. And this is similar to what I talked about in last week's episode about providing guardrails for yourself when it comes to opportunities where you're like, hey, here's a time for you to eat. And now you get to decide whether or not you want to eat and how much you want to eat from the food that's been provided. That's essentially what we're giving our kids when we provide a flexible routine and structure around food. We are assuming leadership when it comes to what we're offering, when we're offering, where we're offering food. We need to take a leadership approach. And a leader is not like an authoritarian, like, you need to do what I say you're doing. You need to eat what I'm providing you. That is not what providing structure is. Structure is here, like here's an eating opportunity, and I'm allowing you the option to figure out what feels best. And when our kids have that flexible structure, it gives them those guardrails that they need where they can learn to better be in tune with their body. So they're able to flex their intuitive eating abilities and develop them within that flexible structure that we provide. The other thing here is that it just helps them trust that access to food is available. It helps them trust that food is reliable and that they don't have to go searching out for food. Or it doesn't mean that we don't take their preferences into consideration. It doesn't mean that we don't adapt structure to support our kids if they're showing us signs of hunger or showing us that they might need to eat more frequently than the structure we're providing them. Not at all. Like the goal is to become responsive to what our kids are needing and adapt our structure to support our family's needs. And we'll definitely be chatting more about that too. But I just wanted to bust this myth because I hear it a lot, but I also have lived it. I understand the fear that comes with it. We don't want to impose any restrictions on our kids because so many of us are healing from that ourselves. But it's important to understand that our kids do still need a supportive environment with food. And part of the way that we create that is by creating a reliable eating routine. And within that routine, we give them full flex to decide whether or not they want to eat and how much they want to eat. And of course, learning to adapt our routine as needed in order to be responsive to what our children might need. So I hope this helps, and I want to encourage you, check out, I'm going to stick this in the show notes, but it is a free guide that I have. It's called The 7 Mistakes I've Made Raising Intuitive Eaters and How You Can Avoid Them. So I talk a little bit about some of these just kind of learning lessons that I found along my journey in terms of feeding my kids and raising my kids. And let me tell you, there's been a lot of bumps along the road. And so I put together this resource just to help you kind of see and learn from the mistakes that I've made. And you can get this download in the show notes for today's episode. But as always, I would love to hear from you. What questions do you have? I know these are all big topics and things that we could probably have an episode on individually. So let me know. Again, in the show notes, there's a comment section at the bottom where you can leave a comment, or also you can leave me a voice memo or connect with me on Instagram and just let me know what your thoughts and questions were about today's episode. I would love to hear from you and just help guide you through this. Thank you so much for being here. I'm so thankful that you're tuning in, and I hope that this is a safe place for you to come and listen and unpack some of these things that we're navigating as moms in eating disorder recovery. So sending you all my love and can't wait to see you next week. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Lift the Shame podcast. For more tips and guidance on your motherhood journey, come connect with me on Instagram at Crystal Kargas. Until next week, Mama, I'll be cheering you on. Bye for now.